All right. Welcome, everyone. It is the top of the hour. It's a pleasure to be learning with you all. This is the fourth session of Exodus, Marching to Sinai with Rabbi David Silber. This class is a continuation of his ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh. It's a careful study of the story of Exodus as the narrative leads to the revelation at Sinai. It is always a pleasure to learn with Rabbi Silber, who is the dean and founder of Drisha. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you. Okay, so today we started a little bit last week. Today we're going to look at the story of the Mon, which is chapter 16 of our book. And the story of the Mon is a story of great significance, really one of the central stories. It's actually central in the sense that the book has 40 chapters, 12 of which towards the end are about the Mishkan, building of the Mishkan. And really the story of the Mon is pretty much right in the middle of the book. And it is the first real narrative after we crossed the sea. This is a story of Mara, of course, in the very beginning, a couple of verses. They couldn't find water, but it's a brief description. And then we travel to Elim. And then in chapter 16, we have the story of the Mon, which is a long chapter, 36 verses, a long chapter, a central chapter. And not only that, but the Mon appears not only here in chapter 16, but once again, we encounter the story of the Mon in chapter 11 of the book of Bamidbar. In each case, there are complaints. And that chapter 11 is, again, a central story in the book of Bamidbar. Chapter 11 is really the beginning of a series of complaints by those who left Egypt, which ends up with their inability to possess the land. Story of the spies, chapters 13 and 14. And it's one story after the next, one complaint after the next. And the Mon is really the first major complaint. There's something just before that, but the Mon is a major complaint. And then once again, in the book of Devarim, once again, there's a reference to the Mon. So the Mon is a central story. Our focus, of course, is on the book of Exodus. That's what we're studying. But just by way of introduction, we're about to encounter a lengthy and not such a simple story, many different pieces to it. So I'd like to try to lay out, in the beginning, what are the real issues over here, why perhaps the Mon is such a central story. So it begins in chapter 16, and the very first verse that we started with last week, which is Vayisu me'elim, Vayavo kol adat b'nei Yisrael el midbar Sinai asher bein Elim uven Sinai, b'chamisha so yom hachodesh hasheni l'tzeitam me'eretz Mitzrayim, Vayilonu kol adat b'nei Yisrael al Moshe v'al Aaron b'midbar, Vayimru alehem b'nei Yisrael v'yitein mutenu b'yad Hashem b'eretz Mitzrayim b'shiftenu al sir basar b'yochenu lechem l'sova ki otzeitem otanu hamidbar hazeh lamit ekol hakahal hazeh bara'av. So the complaint is clear that the people complained, second month, 15 days into the month, and the complaint is, would that we had remained in the land of Egypt. So we were sitting on the flesh pots. We had enough food to satiate us. You brought us here into the desert to kill the congregation through famine. And we ended up last week pointing out that in this little section over here, the word that appears 3 times is the word midbar, the desert. The contrast between the desert on one hand and the flesh pots of Egypt on the other. And actually, even the very first verse, they traveled from Elim. Now, as we saw last week, Elim is mentioned right after Mara. They came to Elim, and then it says, in Elim, there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. And they encamped besides the water. So what you have over here is, Bein Elim uvein Sinai. In other words, they're traveling from leaving Egypt, they're traveling destination, the ultimate destination is the land. There's going to be a stop at Mount Sinai. And now we are sort of in between. We're in the desert. And the complaint over here is you took us out of Egypt and you brought us into the desert. The point about Egypt, we don't know what exactly they ate in Egypt. Later on in the book of Bamidbar, you may recall, they remember the watermelons and the cucumbers and the fish, which we got for nothing. Maybe we'll have a later on today or next week look at those verses, but they were slaves in Egypt. We got them for nothing. It wasn't exactly for nothing, but the point is that in Egypt, there's always food. The idea of Mitzrayim in general, in contrast to the land of Canaan, the main distinction is that in Egypt, typically, with one big exception in the Joseph narrative, but typically there's always food in Egypt. And the reason is that Egypt doesn't rely upon the rain. Egypt, you have the river, the Nile. In the land of Israel, sometimes it rains and sometimes it doesn't rain, and God can withhold the rain. So in the land of Israel, Eretz Canaan, in the Chumash, you are always living in a situation where there might not be sustenance in the future. Now, the desert is certainly that way. You go into a desert, who knows what's going to be in the desert? It doesn't strike me that the desert necessarily is a place where there's a lot of food. But if there is food or isn't food, we don't know going into a desert. There might be and there might not be. In the land of Egypt, we know there is. And that's the point. So what they're going into is a place of, they're going into the unknown, into a place of the unknown, and that is the source of the complaint over here. The complaint we notice, additionally, in these verses, was not leveled directly against God. It's directly the particular complaint over here. We are told explicitly in verse number 2 that the congregation complained against Al Moshe v'Al Haron Bamidbar, which itself is very interesting, because you would think the complaint would be against God. God, who is moving them around from one place to the other, as we studied earlier. God has decided not to allow us to take the direct route to the land of Canaan. It's God that has moved us around in circuitous fashion. But the complaint of the people is not against God over here. The direct complaint is against Moshe and Aaron. What have you done in taking us into this place of the unknown, into the desert? In Elim, there was water. There's 12 springs of water, 70 date trees. So they're leaving a place where there is water, where there is a means of sustenance, and taking us into the desert. This is the introduction to the story of the man. Okay, so this is, of course, and being a slave, on one hand, is, from the Torah's perspective, very negative. Obviously, the whole story is about freedom. God frees us. We can make our own decisions. We can become God's servants, as opposed to the slaves of Pharaoh. From the other perspective, the Torah is well aware of the fact that slavery brings about a certain feeling of, strange to say it, but kind of security. Because as long as you're working for the master, and the master wants you to work, the master doesn't want you to die, because if you die, you can't work. And therefore, you're pretty sure that tomorrow there's going to be a meal, whatever the meal will be. Will it be, cucumbers and watermelons and fish or whatever? This is a different question. But it's the freedom means insecurity in a certain sense, and there's a security in slavery, and the Torah is well aware of this. Later on, the Torah will talk about the slave who doesn't want to leave. The slave says, I love my master. I love my situation. I don't want to be free. That's the very beginning of Parshat Mishpatim. And the Torah says, okay, that option is there. You take the slave to the door, you pierce the ear of the slave, etc. But the Torah is aware of the fact that there's a certain security to slavery. And there's a certain insecurity to freedom and the march to freedom. And this is the introduction to our story of the man. That's a very important point, I think, about the story of the man. That's point number 1. That's the complaint over here. There is another point, which we'll get to hopefully later today, and that is, I began by saying this is a story that appears sort of in the middle of the book. And here's another issue which is related to the Mon. It has to do with the structure of the book of Exodus. If we think about the book of Exodus, the structure of the whole book, it begins with the death of Joseph and his brothers, a new generation, a new Pharaoh. And the new Pharaoh sees the Jewish people, the growth of the Jewish people, wants to limit their growth, wants to subjugate them, and decides to enslave them. And the method of enslavement that we studied the very first chapter of the book, we all remember this, that Pharaoh appointed taskmasters over the people. And the Israelites, the Jews, are instructed to build store cities for Pharaoh. That's how the book of Exodus begins. Now again, Pharaoh doesn't actually care so much about the store cities. The idea of forcing them to work, of enslaving them, is to abuse them, to break them down, to limit them, to limit their growth. But the form that it takes is the building of store cities for Pharaoh. That's how the book begins. Now, how does this book end? The book ends, once again, with building. In fact, there are 12 chapters about building, but not about building store cities for Pharaoh, but v'yosuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, they shall build for me a sacred place, and I will dwell amongst them. And the Torah describes in great detail and repeats both the instruction and the actual building of how, in fact, the building took place. Who were the builders? How did they do it? The specific things that had to be built, etc. So the book is about, one might say, building. The book is about work. Begins with working for Pharaoh, and it ends with working for God, or for God's purpose. And the contrast between the two, which we noted when we studied the very beginning of Exodus, and we'll come back to it hopefully when we complete Exodus, the difference between working for Pharaoh and working for God is clear. And there are many differences. I'll mention one now. It's not our topic right now, but the main difference I wanted to point out is that when you work for Paro doesn't actually care about the store cities. He's making you work to break you down. And the proof that that's the case, we remember, is that later in the book, chapter 5, we all remember this, when Moshe goes to Paro and says, listen, our God wants us to go into the desert and to serve God. Let us go a 3-day journey into the desert to serve God. And Pharaoh says to Moshe, you can't do that. There's so many of you. How can we do this? Not to work, so many people not working. And he instructs his own Egyptian taskmasters, who were in charge of the Hebrew taskmasters, to punish them. They're just lazy. They don't want to work. So I'll tell you what, take away the straw they used to build the bricks. And make sure you tell them they have to still fulfill the quota of bricks. Even though they're not given the straw, they have to forage for the straw. They have to go around the land and find the straw. And it's really not possible to produce the same number of bricks. How could you produce it? You don't have the straw. Spending all the time trying to find the straw. So of course they come back and they have bricks, but not enough bricks. And the Hebrew taskmasters are beaten because the slaves have failed in the task of producing enough bricks for each day. Now, the point that we made at the time about that story, among other things, is that if Paro were really interested in the store cities, if I were Paro, and I wanted to clamp down on the Jews, I would have said something very different. How many bricks do you make per hour? 15 bricks per hour? From now on, you're making 20. That's what I would have said. And this way, they have to produce more bricks. They have to work harder, and I can build my more store cities. I can get more work out of them. But Paro does something that he knows they won't be able to do. But how does that help him building the store cities? It hurts. But of course, the clear implication is that, and the inference we draw, is that he doesn't care about the store cities. That was never the purpose of the store cities. But even when Suman and Otobasiv is to break us down, the work is an excuse. So you're working for somebody who doesn't actually care about the work. That itself is you're doing a job that's meaningless, actually. You're doing just busy time work, just to keep you busy. But the work has no real purpose. When you come to the end of the book, we'll have to talk more about this, hopefully. You talk about building the Mishkan. One of the terms used in the Torah, which becomes a central term, if you ever studied the laws of Shabbat, or tractate Shabbat, there are two words that are front and center when it comes to the rules and the laws of Shabbat. Two words, Melechet Machshevet, purposeful labor. Melechet Machshevet comes up in tractate Shabbat, study the Gemara, in multiple contexts. But the idea that work on Shabbat that's prohibited is work that has a purpose. If it's work with no purpose, or if it's destructive, then it doesn't fall under the general category of work. The definition of work is constructive work. And Melechet Machshevet comes up in many different contexts, in terms of intention, in terms of purpose. I can't get into that now. That's a big topic in its own right. But the contrast between the end of the book and the beginning of the book is very striking. The beginning of the book is about working for someone who doesn't actually care about the work. Work's an excuse. And the end of the book is about working on a project where it's all about intention and purpose. Melechet Machshevet. Now, there are many other differences between working for Paro and working for God, which is the frame of this book. And the reason I mention all this, because here in the story of the man, it's also about work. What does work mean? You're going out and you are working in order to produce the things that you need to live. So the man is exactly that. They're in a desert. How are they going to eat? There's no food in the desert. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but there's no certainty of food. So you're going to go out and you're going to work for your food. And you're going to go out every single day to collect the food. You have to go out and collect the food every day, because it doesn't keep from one day to the next. So here the Torah has, among other things, raised this question of work, the purpose of work, the value of work, big topic. But right smack in the middle of this book, which begins with labor and ends with labor, we have this long story of the man. So we have to bear that in mind as well. Okay, those are 2 points I wanted to make even before we start looking into the details of this chapter. And the chapter does raise some very difficult questions. Okay, we're going to begin now. Before we begin now with verse number 4, I just wanted to stop for a moment. Does anybody have any comments or questions, anything I said till now?
No, nothing in chat so far.
Okay, fine. Okay, here we go. So let's begin. I'm not sure we'll finish them on today, but we're going to start. Verse number 4. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim. V'yatza'am v'laktu dvayom b'yomo. Uman anasenu hayelech b'torati imlo. That's verse number 4. Right? God said to Moshe, I will rain down bread, mamtir, from heaven. The people shall go out and collect it every day. Uman anasenu. In order that I try or test them, will they hayelech b'torati imlo? Will they walk in my path, in my Torah, or not? We'll get back to that verse, critical verse, obviously. And then verse number 5, V'ayom bayom hashishi ve'echinu et asher yaviu. But on the 6th day, they shall apportion or prepare what they bring in. V'ayom mishneh asher yukatu yom yom, and it will be a double portion, double the portion that they gather each day. Okay, before I get to some of the specifics of these two central verses, let me point out that presumably verse number 4 is a response to the people's complaint, right? The people complained in the first verses. They complained against Moshe and Aaron, you brought us to a desert. The Torah doesn't say that Moshe and Aaron turned to God and said the people are complaining. Sometimes it does that. Over here, it doesn't do that. So presumably God is responding to the complaint. Now, one could make the claim, I think, which I would take seriously, that in any event, let's say the people had not complained, but their point is well taken. I mean, the point is, how are we going to live in the desert? Can we assume there's going to be food in the desert? I mean, you can't presume that. So whether they complained or didn't complain, it would still be up to someone, and who better than God, to assure them that there will be food somehow, some way. Again, remember that the complaint is when they get to the desert. That's how the Torah represents it. So it is possible to argue, I think, that this verse is not really a direct response to the people's complaint. It's a separate statement. It follows upon the complaint. But in any event, it will be necessary to instruct the people about how they will survive in the desert. The way it's positioned in the text, though, it does sound like it's some kind of a response. That's point number one. But what's interesting is that right here in the beginning, when God speaks to Moshe about the man, but this verse number 5 seems to be, if not out of place, certainly not a direct response to what the people are saying. People's question is, how are we going to eat? Answer is, I'm going to rain down food from heaven. That's the answer. But it's interesting that the Torah added something, God adds something here, namely, that on the 6th day, they shall prepare for the next day. And they'll be able to take a double portion, which presumably wouldn't be necessary to say right here, because the direct response to the complaint is, don't worry, there's food. I'm going to provide you food every day. But in any event, we do take note of the fact that here we have in the Chumash a mention of Shabbat. It's really the first time we have a mention of Shabbat. And it turns out, interestingly enough, that the story of the man is, I would say, from the standpoint, if you study the Mishnah and the Gemara of Tractate Shabbat and the next tractate which follows, which is Tractate Eruvin, two long tractates, which really are one. One is the laws of Shabbat, and Eruvin is about carrying, largely about carrying. That these, and the first Mishnah in Shabbat is about carrying, actually. The Tractate Shabbat, which has many chapters, I forget how many, 22, I think it is the two main foci of Tractate Shabbat are the prohibition of carrying on Shabbat and also cooking on Shabbat. Those are the main two mulachot of the 39 that is singled out in the tractate. They provide most of the tractates about that. And cooking on Shabbat and carrying on Shabbat are both connected to the story of the man. You're talking about the man is actually much more than the Ten Commandments. The rabbinic traditions about Shabbat, if you had to pick one biblical text, this is it, chapter 16. So it's very striking. Once again, underscoring the centrality of how Chazal understood the story of the man. But we'll get to the Shabbat later on. In any event, I wanted to come back to verse number 4. And God said to Moshe, Hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim. This is the critical verse. And will literally rain down. So they translate, rain down bread from heaven. The people shall go out. They will go out every day and gather this food. Laman anasenu, in order that I will try or test them whether they follow my Torah or not. So here, let me just begin this way. Last week we discussed the idea of anasedu, the idea of a nisayon. It came up last week in the context of Mara. That's the first place they go to after they cross the sea. And we're told that for 3 days they traveled in the desert, they have no water. And they come to a place called Mara, which means bitter or bitterness. And they can't drink the water. There is water, but the water is bitter. And the people complained. Once again, what can we drink? And Moshe cries out to God, and God shows Moshe a way to sweeten the waters. Vayireo Hashem eitz, etc. Sham sam lo choku mishpat. There in Mara, God gave statutes and ordinances. V'sham nisahu, and there God tested them. V'sham nisahu. That's just earlier in the previous chapter, verse number 25. We saw this last week. What does V'sham nisahu mean? So I mentioned last week a very fundamental disagreement between Rashi and the Ramban. For Rashi, V'sham nisahu, which is based on the Gemara, that God tested them, Sham nisahu, for Rashi, it's whether or not you're going to keep the Choku Mishpat. In Mara, they were given Choku Mishpat. They were given Chukim and Mishpatim, says Rashi, they were given the laws. The Mitzvot Sheba Mara. They were given some laws. That's Choku Mishpat. V'sham nisahu presumably means, and there they were tested. And for Rashi, it presumably means tested as to whether they're going to be able to keep the laws. That's the test. And Rashi says exactly that over here. Rashi says, God said to Moshe, I'm going to rain down the man from heaven. They'll go out and collect it every day. In our verse, in verse number 4, namely, will they follow my Torah or not? What does Rashi say? Will they follow my Torah? Says Rashi, there are two mitzvot connected to the man, says Rashi. One is, they have to go out every day. You can't save the man from day to day. So I'm going to test them. Will they go out every day? So Rashi says, we're back in chapter 16, verse number 4. And Rashi says, I'm going to test them if they follow my Torah. For Rashi, the Torah is, will they try to save it from day to day? Or will they understand they can't be saved? That's one mitzvah. And then Rashi says, the second is verse number 5, that on the 6th day, they gather a double portion, and this will be one portion for the 6th day and one portion for the 7th day. In other words, you're going to go out every day, but not on Shabbat. On Shabbat, you don't go out because on Shabbat, you have the portion already from the 6th day. The idea of preparing for Shabbat, which is implicit in what it says over here. You go out on the 6th day, there'll be a double portion. You're not going to eat two portions on the 6th day. You eat one portion on the 6th day, one portion on the 7th day. And here we have the idea of preparing for Shabbat. The idea of preparing for Shabbat, which is a central idea of preparing for Shabbat, and it has a particular, it plays out, I would say, on the rabbinic level in a particular concept, which is central to the laws of Shabbat. Once again, it's all coming out of the mud, but what is the concept which is central to the idea that everything has to be prepared for Shabbat? One word. You know what the word is? The word is muktzah. What does muktzah mean? Muktzah means set aside. In other words, there are things that you can't move on Shabbat. The idea that because it has no purpose for Shabbat, everything's prepared for Shabbat. Whatever not prepared for Shabbat can't be moved. That's the concept called muktzah. So certain things are implicitly prepared for Shabbat, such as food. Food, that's implicit, right? Vessels that you use, that's prepared. Whether you have food, let's say, whether you put food in a storage room and you didn't expect to eat it on Shabbat, and then suddenly you need it, that's a debate in the Talmud. We hold you can take that food. It's implicitly prepared. But the whole concept that things have to be prepared for Shabbat, everything that you can use on Shabbat was already set aside for Shabbat. That's the idea of muktzah, and that's implicit over here. So Rashi's understanding is, God says to Moshe, listen, I'm going to give them man, I'm going to give them bread from heaven in order to test them. Will they keep my Torah or not? And Rashi comments, of course, we expect it from Rashi. Will they keep the mitzvot associated with the man? What are the mitzvot? Not to leave it over. You can't leave it over. And on Shabbat, you can't go out to get it. So the Shabbat is tied in with the man. You have to prepare for the seventh day. You have to prepare for Shabbat. That is the position of Rashi. That's Rashi's position. Hayelech b'torati imlo. Others, the Ramban, the Ibn Ezra, they don't understand it that way at all. Laman anasenu is not for the Ramban or the Ibn Ezra, will they keep the mitzvot associated with the man. That's how Rashi sees everything in terms of mitzvot. That's Rashi.
And
Ramban
Rabbi
doesn't say that.
Silber,
Yes?
it's like the machshava is the essence of muktzah. So you can't even think about it. He's already telling you, don't even go out there, because it's what, you shouldn't have the machshava that you might get food the next day. Because
Okay,
muktzah
right.
is
Muktzah is, of course, right. In other words, the idea that the special days, the holy days require preparation is something that even goes beyond Shabbat. My point being that it's coming out of the story of the man, the idea of muktzah. Muktzah means everything was already set up for Shabbos before, preparing for Shabbos. The whole week, in a sense, is a preparation for Shabbos. That's very true. And that's Rashi. I mean, and Ramban agrees with the concept. He doesn't disagree with that. But the point of the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra is that's not what it means. Luman anasenu. The test is not, are they going to keep the particular mitzvot? That's not the purpose. The purpose for the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra is to develop a kind of faith, a faith in God, that God will in fact provide for you. That's the question. The question is God going to provide for me? Because remember, the idea of the man is you don't know what's going to be tomorrow. Yes, there's food today, but it doesn't keep. It's not just you're not allowed to store it. You can't actually store it because it's going to become no good. It's going to become ruined. It's going to become inedible. And therefore, the point of the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra, similarly, is exactly this point. The people complain, we're in Egypt, we knew tomorrow we're going to have food. Because our master doesn't want us to die, because he wants us to work. And therefore, we know we're going to get food. But now in the desert, how do we know what's going to be? So what God is saying is, you don't know what's going to be. But if you trust in me, don't worry about it. I want you to understand you can have faith in me. I'm going to provide for you. For the Ramban, the Ibn Ezra, that's what it means, Luman anasenu. And it's a much bigger point, actually, especially for the Ramban. I mentioned this several times. It's central to the Ramban's commentary on the Torah. The Ramban's commentary on the Torah makes it clear the goal is not the mitzvot. Mitzvot is necessary for the Ramban, but not sufficient. The goal is not you're going to keep the mitzvot. That's Rashi's goal. Ramban's goal is you'll be a holy people. The mitzvot are necessary to get you there, but they're insufficient. Because as the Ramban says, very strikingly, you can keep all the mitzvot and be a bad person. A naval b'shuta Torah. Technically speaking, you didn't violate any mitzvot. Says the Ramban, okay, but you're not a kadosh either. You could be a naval. You could be a disgusting human being even. It's the Ramban. I didn't make that up. So the Luman anasenu is exactly this point, exactly the same dispute, which appears many places in their commentaries, and that is, what is the ultimate goal? But for the Ramban, Ibn Ezra, this is the goal, to inculcate in people a sense of faith, a trust in God. Luman anasenu. And on Shabbat as well, you can't go on. On Shabbat. You won't be able to go out and have food. You can't collect any food. So you have to understand. You're going to on Friday. You're collecting for Shabbat. Shabbat's a day where you don't go out. You don't collect. Yes, I'll stop here. Any comments or questions? Speak up.
Sandra, you had a question?
Rabbi Silber, it just flashed at me when you were saying this, that if your analysis at first, comparing the labor that Israel was doing and what Israel is going to be complaining about, saying we got the cucumbers and the fish and the watermelons for free, and of course it wasn't for free, it was in a quid pro quo for their slave labor. And if now the Laman Anasenu, what is the test? I would have to say Ramban and Ibn Ezra get it right, because the quid pro quo, the test for this now, for giving them the man, it's really a one-to-one correspondence with the watermelons and paro analogy. The quid pro quo is the trust in God. So it's an object lesson in showing, yeah, the food comes with a price. Okay, but the price is to the quote unquote free/slave price you had to pay in Mitzrayim. This time it's trust in God. That's the price for the quote unquote free man.
Right. I'm not sure I use the word price exactly, but I get your point for sure.
I mean, I'm using it with quotes on it. In other words, nothing is free.
Of course, it is, and it is. It's not a simple matter for the slaves to have this kind of faith. I mean, because they didn't
before, it
they
wasn't
didn't
free. It
grow
was
up with this
slave
kind
labor.
of belief. They have to have this kind of trust.
That's
It
right.
takes a long time to inculcate it, and that's the point over here. And
Exactly.
as we'll see, that they don't seem to pass the test initially, because we'll see in the chapter, we'll get to that also. They seem to fail the test. If not fail, they do poorly on the test. We'll get to that, because some people do go out on Shabbat, and some people do try to save it for the next day. So we didn't get a high grade, a grade A on this. Maybe it's a C or a D or maybe even an F. I have no idea. But as we'll see later on,
doesn't it take a while for them to morph, for them to grow?
It takes a long time, of course. It takes a long time to change your way to see the world and you see yourself, for sure.
But that's why I think Ramban has it, which is because it's carrying your analogy. It's really almost one-to-one correspondence. The fish and the labor for Pharaoh, and then here the man, and then the price exacted by God, what He wants from them, what He desires from them, and that's the trust.
Right. No, I my own inclination is to lean towards the Ramban, certainly, but for many reasons, I think the Ramban's reading of the book in general is much closer to the plain meaning of the book. The Ramban reads the book straight through, and it's all in order. Rashi has to say no. The Mishnah's out of order. Came after the golden calf and all that, but the Ramban says that's not what it says in the book. If you read the book straight, it's pretty clear that the trajectory of the Ramban is the most obvious and most clearest, the reading of the book, in my view. But we'll get more to that as we proceed through the book. Okay, now there's something else over here. There is something else which is very important, and that's something which I've spoken about many times, and that is verse number 5. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, Hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim. The word that's interesting for our purposes is the word mamtir, which is the word matar. Now, matar usually means rain. However, when you look at the Torah, you see that the word matar does not always mean rain. Matar can have other meanings as well. For example, when the story of Sodom and Amorah and the destruction of Sodom and Amorah says, Hashem himtir al Sodom v'Amorah gafrit va'esh. Right? Sulfur and fire will rain down upon, right? So the rain down doesn't mean rain. Rain down doesn't mean rain. In case of the Barak, the term matar is used, the barad, rather, the seventh plague, right? There was rain, there was eish mitlakachat, right? There was the fire inside the barad, inside the hail, which comes down. It's not rain, but it comes down from heaven. It's rain down upon them, but there it's fire, destructive fire. In the case of Sodom, it's destructive fire. So matar actually means things which are rained down, but not necessarily in the positive sense. In other words, the idea of matar in general, and we've spoken about this many times, that matar, God raining down on people on the earth, is a way of God's judgment. It's a way of God bringing about, the consequences of one's action. In the land of Egypt, there's no matar because you have the Nile. So the water is there. When you get into the land, the Torah says, sometimes it rains and sometimes it doesn't rain. We read the Shema, the second paragraph of the Shema. If you misbehave, lo yiyeh matar. V'yatzat hashamayim lo yiyeh matar. It won't be rain. So rain is the way in which God is bringing about. We are actually receiving from God the consequences of our behavior or our misbehavior. And over here it fits very, very well. Mamtir lochem lechem min hashamayim. What God is saying is, I'm going to be mamtir lechem min shamayim, uman anasenu hayelech b'torati imlo. I would, whether they follow my path or not. Actually, in this case, Rashi is even better. In other words, what the people are being taught, okay, is that you are a responsible person. This is part of the lesson of being free. You have to take responsibility for your actions. And the fact of the matter is, if you behave properly, it's all good. If you misbehave, then the matar could be negative. I think there's a very deep point over here about the story, which is this is in the march to freedom, becoming fully free. People have to understand that there's a price of freedom, not just the insecurity of freedom, but you actually become responsible for what you do. The more freedom you have, the more responsible you are for what you do. And that's a theme that will run through the entire Torah. The second generation of Israelites, not those who left Egypt, but those that are born in the desert, are held more accountable, actually, than the first generation. Because the first generation, yes, they misbehaved, yes. At the end of the day, on some level, they're always slaves. And you can't demand from the slave the same thing you demand from the free person. The theme that I place before you good and evil, life and death, you shall choose life. And if not, there are all kinds of consequences, negative consequences, is a fundamental theme of Sefer Devarim, the book addressed to a free people. Those themes don't appear in the same way in the first 4 books of the Torah, because they're not fully free. So here we have this idea, as we set out in the journey, of Uman Anasenu, and in particular, Mamtir Lochem Lechem Min Hashamayim, the idea of the matar. Again, very central. That's why the Mon story is so important. It's really the beginning of the march to freedom. Okay, let's continue a little bit more here. And we'll come back to the Shabbat later on, which is, again, part and parcel of the story over here. And, of course, is related to one of the questions that I raised in the beginning by way of introduction, namely the idea of work. I just wanted to point out, as we proceed through the chapter, that the story of the Mon, I framed it in terms of kind of an intermediate story in this book, which begins with labor and ends with labor. And I pointed out the difference between working for Paro, meaningless work actually, and working to build the Mishkan of Melechet Machshevet. But actually, there's something else very interesting in terms of Paro and the contrast between working for Paro and building the Mishkan is that when you work for Paro, there's no Shabbat. When Moshe went to Paro and said, our God wants us to go out to the desert to serve God, 3-day journey it's going to take, and Paro said, Lama Moshe v'Aaron tashbitu et ha'am. Why would you, says Paro to Moshe, tashbitu, cause them to cease to work, tashbitu, Shabbat. Why have you given them a Shabbos? They have to work. They can't take it. There's no days off in this work. When it comes to the Mishkan, it's exactly the opposite. When it comes to the Mishkan, what's so striking about the Mishkan is that on 2 different occasions, both of the instructions to build the Mishkan and the actual building of the Mishkan, when it comes to the instructions to build the Mishkan, which end in chapter 31, after all the instructions are given, and then God said to Moshe, V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, v'asot et ha-Shabbat l'dorotam brit olam. The conclusion of the instructions to build the Mishkan is the Shabbat. and the actual building of the Mishkan, which starts in chapter 35, verse number 4. The first verse is Vayakel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael vayomer alehem. Moshe gathered all of Israel, and Moshe instructs them, you must keep the Shabbat. You have to keep the Shabbat. You're not allowed to do work on Shabbat. So when it comes to the Mishkan, both in the instructions and the actual building, one culminates with the Shabbat, and the Shabbat introduces the building of the Mishkan. What the Chumash seems to be saying is, you're going to build a Mishkan. That's fine. If you're Suli Mikdash, you should all build the Mishkan, but not on Shabbat. When it comes to Shabbat, you still maintain the Shabbat. That's only one way to read it. In other words, God insists that when you work for God, God insists that there's a day that you don't work. When it comes to Paro, he insists that there's no day that you don't work. You can never have a Shabbat. So that's quite interesting over here. I mention this over here because if we see this story of the Mon as a story, among other things, about work, okay? And what the Torah is insisting over here is that you work 6 days a week, but you don't work on that seventh day. On that seventh day, you don't go out to work. You have to prepare for the seventh day because on that day, you're not going to work. So there's something very interesting, and maybe we'll discuss this later on, about Shabbat in terms of work. In other words, the question is, what does Shabbat tell me about the rest of the week? That's the interesting question. Leaving Shabbat in and of itself being significant, but what are the implications over here about work? What's the idea that one day you don't work? How does that relate to the days that you do work? And here, the Torah seems to be highlighting that. In other words, God says, but not on the seventh day. This day you don't work. So again, when thinking about work, which is one of the central themes of the book, and the central theme of our lives, we spend a lot of time working, more time working than doing anything else. So that's a question that the Chumash is already raising over here in the context of the Mon. Okay, this is all by way of, again, now let's get into the actual story, and we will see what we have over here. Let's begin now in verse number 6. There are some difficulties in this chapter that we'll deal with next week, I presume. Anyway, let's continue. Vayomer Moshe v'Aaron el kol b'nei Yisrael erev vidatem ki Hashem hotzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. So Moshe and Aaron said to the people, at night you will know that God took you out of Egypt. Uvoker, in the morning, uritem et kavod Hashem v'shamoa tunotechem al Hashem v'nachnu ma ki to'alinu aleinu. So the first speech of Moshe and Aaron saying, listen, they're responding to the complaints of the people. And they talk about what's going to happen in the evening and what's going to happen in the morning. In the evening, you will know that God took you out of Egypt. And then in the morning, you will experience the presence of God, Kvod Hashem, God's presence. You will experience God's presence. And Moshe adds, who are we that you complain about us? In other words, Moshe says, you've addressed your complaint to the wrong party. We didn't take you into the desert. We can't provide food. We're just God's messengers. It's God that provides the food. And you have to come to understand that. And it sounds like, from what Moshe says, that there are two different things they have to understand. Because one is Erev Vidatem, and in the morning, Uritem et Kvod Hashem. It sounds like it's two different things. There's one thing in the Erev to know that God took you out of Egypt. In the morning, you will somehow experience God's presence. That's the first statement of speech that Moshe makes. But now in the next pasuk, Moshe is continuing to speak, but it begins Vayomer Moshe. So it's a separate statement. Moshe is still talking, but there's another separate statement over here. Vayomer Moshe, and now Moshe speaks. V'teit Hashem lochem ba'erev basar lechol ulechem ba'boker l'sboa. V'shmoa Hashem et tchunotechem asher atem marinim orav. V'nachnu ma lo'aleinu tchunotechem ki al Hashem. Moshe seems to be explaining what he just said. Listen, when God gives you, and at night, basar lecho, meat. Basar is meat. Lechem baboker lispoa, and bread in the morning to satiate you. Lechem doesn't mean bread usually. It means food in general. But basar specifically means meat. So there is a contrast between the evening meal of meat. God will provide meat in the evening, but sustaining food in the morning. It's erev uboker. And God, having done this, God is clear that God hears your complaints. God's responding to your complaints. And Moshe says again, your grumbling should not be directed to us. If we're going to run into a big question, I would say a problem actually, what is this business of the meat in the evening? And the reason, of course, the meat in the evening is a major problem because of a story, maybe we'll pick up with this next week, the story that appears, the Mon story that appears not in this book, but in the book of Bamidbar. Because in the book of Bamidbar, there's another complaint about the Mon. We'll get to that next week, the specifics of that complaint. As I mentioned, the Mon is a very central story. And there, in response to the complaints of the people, God says to Moshe, I'm going to bring them, and the people want to eat meat. People complain, there are no cucumbers and watermelons. And God says, I'm going to give them plenty of food. And remember that Moshe said at that point, how could you, I'm going to give them all meat, not for one day, not for 2 days, not for a week, but for a whole month, till they're sick of it. And Moshe said to God, how could you do that? There's so many people. You can't do that. Moshe doubts God's ability to do it. That's what it sounds like. And God says, listen, God can do whatever God wants to do. So we'll get to that story. And God brings the slav, the quail. So what's interesting is there it sounds like the quail, they weren't eating quail every night. But here it sounds like they are eating every night. There's going to be meat, and we'll see it's the quail, the slav. How do you reconcile those two stories? How do they be reconciled? That we'll deal with next week. But I just pointing out that we have nighttime is the basar, and the morning is the lechem. Okay, and that's what Moshe says. Let me take a couple more verses, and I'll stop and take any comments or questions. Vayom Moshe el Aaron. Now Moshe speaks to Aaron. And Ma'arel called Adat b'nei Yisrael kirvu lefnei Hashem ki shama tlunotechem. Moshe says to Aaron, tell the people, come close to God. God has heard your complaints. That's a sort of a softer it's a softer way to say it. It's interesting that it's Aaron who's going to tell that to the people. Aaron's always softer. When it comes to the people, he's more understanding, he's more sympathetic. Tell the people, God is hearing your complaints. And Aaron does so. As Aaron is speaking to the entire congregation, and behold, the glory of God, the presence of the God appeared to the people. Okay, so it sounds like actually this is prior to the evening in which the God will provide them meat. So Aaron is speaking to the people, reassuring the people that God has heard their complaints, and then the people somehow are experiencing God's presence. Because before we continue with the story, let me just stop for a moment and take, if there are any questions, comments, or whatever, please speak up.
And if you're having trouble unmuting yourself, I'm happy to do that.
David, you had mentioned before that there was a connection between carrying and Shabbat. What were you referring to?
What I'm referring to is the verse that appears later on, later in the chapter with Shabbat. Later in the chapter, I just mentioned in that, later in the chapter, we are told that on the seventh day rather, by Yom HaShvi'i, they were told explicitly, take a double portion on the 6th day.
Right.
On the 7th day, there won't be any man. There won't be any food on the 7th day. That's what they were told explicitly. But in verse number 27, Vayhi bayom hashvi'i yatzu min ha'amru kol v'lo matzo. On the 7th day, some people went out, and they tried to find the food. They were told explicitly there wouldn't be any. Nonetheless, of course, they disobeyed, and they go out on the 7th day. And God responds in verse number 28. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, ad ona me'antem l'shmor mitzvotai v'torotai. God is exasperated. How long will you refuse to obey my commands and my Torah? Ruchi Hashem natan lechem Shabbat. God has given you the Shabbat. Therefore, I give you on the sixth day. Al keinu notenu lachem bayom hashishi lechem yomayim. Now we have the verse. Shavu ish tachtav. Everybody should stay where you are. Al yetzei ish mimkomo bayom hashvi'i. Do not leave your place on the seventh day. In the Talmud, that verse, Shavu ish tachtav. Al yetzei ish mimkomo bayom hashvi'i. The Talmud, the Gemara in general, overall suggests two different possible readings of that verse. This is very important. What does it mean? Shvu ish tachtav, al yetzei ish mimkomo bayom hashvi'i. There's a disagreement, two different possibilities what that might mean. One view is al yetzei ish mimkomo bayom hashvi'i, stay at home, don't leave your place, has to do with the law we call Tuchum Shabbat. That the prohibition of walking a certain distance from where you are, you're limited in where you can walk. 2,000 cubits, according to one view, 12 mil, according to a different view. There's a whole dispute in the Talmud and the commentaries on the Talmud whether such a prohibition at the end of the day actually exists or is just rabbinic. There are three different opinions over there. The Tosafos think it's all rabbinic. Some think that it's from the Torah, and some think that the 12 mil is from the Torah, but the 2,000 cubits are rabbinic. But basically that's one point of view. That ayetze ish mimkomo, don't leave your place, refers to what we call Tuchum, or Tuchum Shabbat. That's one view. But the other view, al yetze ish mimkomo bayom hashvi'i, al yetze ish, they interpret not that you shouldn't leave your place, but al yetze ish means you shouldn't leave your place taking things with you, like taking your basket to collect the food. Not so much al yetze ish, but al yotzi ish. And that's the malacha they call hotzah, which is how the first chapter of Tractate Shabbat begins. And frankly, Tuchum Shabbat is the major focus of Tractate Eruvin, which is another 100-blot chapter. In other words, the point is, this verse, al yetze ish mimkomo, whether it's carrying or whether it's tchum, is one of the main cruxes of Tractate Shabbat plus Eruvin, about 32 chapters altogether, a tremendous chunk of the Talmud. And it's all coming out of this verse. So in any event, whatever it means, we get to the verse, we'll talk some more about what the simple pshat is, But certainly, don't leave your place. The idea of the Shabbat is, again, the rabbinic tradition is that you can walk out of your house. But the point is, the simple reading of the verse is don't stay home. Don't go out. In this case, don't go out to collect the food because it's not going to be there. And it's not going to be there for a reason. I don't want you on this day to work. I don't want you to go out. So that's what I'm referring to, this particular verse, which is, if you had to pick out one verse in terms of the laws of the Shabbat, this is the verse. You have half of the Shabbat and Eruvin here in one little verse. Al yetzi ish mimkomo bayom hashvi'i. So this is the rule of Shabbat. And here's where Shabbat is first really found in some detail. And this is what God is saying that, now, let me just point out a different point, which is the following. It comes back to another, well, before I point this out, because this will take a few minutes, is there anybody else who has a comment about anything that's been said so far?
I just want to say that nisyonot, and it defines you when you're having this nisyonot, and nes is really the degel that defines your shevet. When you were discussing the nisyonot, it's all from the same word. And I just wanted to mention that.
I will talk about the nisayon right now.
Okay. Oh.
I will discuss the nisayon right now. First of all, the reason that's given in the beginning of this chapter, God says to Moshe, I'm going to give them mamtir mon min alechem min hashamayim. They will go out and gather it, l'man anasenu, in order that I test them. So this raises the question, what is the purpose of the test? In fact, we just read this past Shabbat, Parshat Vayera, and then we have the word nisayon, nisa. chapter 22 of the book of Breshit,
Okay.
Akedat Yitzchak, Achar Adrim Ha'eleh, Elohim Nisa et Abraham. God tested Abraham. And now the question is, what is the nature of the test of Abraham? Why is God testing Abraham? Why does Abraham have to be tested? This is a problem that bothered the great commentaries of our tradition. The Rambam is one, the Ramban is another one, and they make suggestions about, about what the idea of a nisayon is. My problem with the Rambam certainly is that when you're reading the Chumash, I think what the Rambam says doesn't actually work in the Chumash at all. It may work in the world of philosophy, but it doesn't work in the Chumash. The Rambam says that the purpose of a nisayon was not for Abraham, but rather for the reader. When you read the story of Abraham, you understand what it means to have faith. You appreciate Abraham's faith, etc. But the test for Abraham was not that Abraham needs to be tested at all. And that's an interesting idea. But in terms of learning the Chumash, that's not possible. I mean, when you read the Chumash, things aren't happening in the story to teach others. Things happen in the story because it's central to the story. So I think in terms of Pshuto Shel Mikra, we can discount the Rambam altogether. In terms of philosophy, it's interesting. What lessons can we learn from the Akedah, which is a good question. But the idea that the whole idea of Nisa is just for the reader, not for Abraham, strikes me as not possible, at least from the literary perspective, as I understand it. Ramban had a different idea, not just the Ramban. The idea of a test is, in the case of Abraham, is to reward somebody for what they do. You don't reward people for what they're thinking. So this kind of approach is that the idea of the test is that Abraham will pass the test. God gives Abraham the opportunity to pass the test. And if Abraham will pass the test, then the reward, the promise made to Abraham can be confirmed, which is what happens at the Akedah. God says to Abraham, or the angel says, speaking for God, you passed the test. You didn't refuse to hand over your son. You were willing to sacrifice your son. And then you'll be blessed, and all the blessings of the past are confirmed and reconfirmed and finalized at the end of the Akedah. So it's a way to assure that someone who should be rewarded can get the appropriate reward. You don't get rewards for what you're thinking. You get rewards for what you do. You can think all kinds of thoughts. At the end of the day, the question is, what did you do? Again, that may work in the case of the Akedah, but it doesn't seem to work very well in our story. Because if the purpose is to reward the people for what they do, well, they don't do so well on this test. We came to the Shabbat, for example. Some people went out and could not find the food on Shabbat. Now, the Torah doesn't say how many. Was it 5%? Was it 10%? Was it 20%? Was it 42%? Was it 58%? The Chumash doesn't say. Mina'am sounds like it's not all the people, certainly, maybe a minority. But God is very angry. And God talks in general, right? And on the me'antem, how long will you refuse to follow my rules, my Torah? So God takes this as a rejection of God, not just by these few people. It's much bigger than that. So therefore, the idea of the nisayon, and that's when we study the Akedah, that's the point I was pushing, that the idea of Elohim nisad Abraham, to test or to try Abraham, is the idea of education. The idea of the test, in the case of the Akedah, is that through the test, Abraham will affirm and confirm a truth which he not necessarily has fully understood till this point. And the truth that he has to affirm is that Isaac is his one and only covenantal son. In the case of the Akedah, in the previous chapter, he set Yishmael away. So Isaac is the only son that's left. There is no Yishmael with him. Yishmael was sent away with his mother. He's going to marry a woman from Egypt. He's still Abraham's son, but he's fundamentally Hagar's son at that point. So one might say that Isaac is Abraham's son by default. Bincha Yechidcha, your only son, the only one left. But the Torah doesn't want that. God doesn't want that. God wants Avram to understand that Isaac is his covenantal son, not by virtue of the fact that there's nobody else left, but by virtue of the fact that his son and Sarah's son is in fact the covenantal son. And in order to do that, the point of the Akedah then becomes the reclaiming of Isaac. Isaac is, yes, going to be sacrificed, and Abraham's going to reclaim him through the bringing of a sacrificial substitute. In this reading, the ayil, which is Nechaz Basfach B'Karnav, is not incidental to the story. It's central to the story. That's the purpose. He has to affirm, in a positive sense, I reclaim my son Isaac. Yishmael was sent away. He should live and be well. God said he will be blessed, but I don't reclaim him as covenantal. Isaac is reclaimed. That's what when we studied the Akedah, that was the position that I took, and I emphasized very much. And I think that it's a good interpretation for other reasons. It fits in very well into the entire Abraham narrative, which to me is the test of whether it's a good interpretation or not. It addresses the core issue in Abraham's story: who was my successor? And related to that is, do I have a partner in this, or I'm all alone? Abraham thinks he's all alone. Sarah, he may love Sarah, but that's his sister. And God says, no, she's your covenantal partner. And that's what Abraham has to understand at the Akedah. And he understands it finally, and that's why Parshat Chayei Sarah, it's all about finding a place for Sarah. Not just a burial ground for Sarah, but a place that represents the acquisition of the land, Sarah's grave primarily. Anyway, then a replacement for Sarah, which is Rebecca. Okay, that's we studied Breshit. I'm saying it in brief. There's a lot more to say. But my point is, over here, Leman Anasenu is not I'm going to give them a chance to get a reward by doing the right thing. They don't do the right thing. A lot of them do the wrong thing. And not only that, a lot of them don't try to save the food to the next day. So there were 2 mitzvot, and we didn't do well in either one. Again, do we get a 70? Do we get a 60? Do we get a 50? Do we get a 1? Who knows what the grade is? But it can't be just to give us reward. It's to instruct. And sometimes you learn through failure. Mostly, people learn things in life, if they learn at all. It's usually through failure. As the Talmud says, "Hamachshela azot tachat yodecha, and divrei Torah mitkaimim el v'misha nichshel b'hem tchila." We only learn through our mistakes, if we learn at all. If we own up to the mistakes, we can learn something. So that's Leman Anasenu. That's the point I wanted to make about the Nisayon. The Nisayon is not just a way to give reward. It's not about someone else should read the story, obviously. No. It's about addressing a core issue and trying to get people to understand it, which is what we've been talking about the whole time. What is the core issue? The core issue is you have a bunch of slaves who were used to be given things, not used to having the consequences of their behavior. Yes, if they don't work, they're going to be trouble. But they know their master wants them to work, and tomorrow there's going to be food. So they have the security of slavery, not the insecurity of freedom. And this is the point of the Mon. You're going to a midbar. And God says, if you believe in me, if you have faith in me, you'll be able to survive. You'll be able to live with this. And this is the Nisayon. But in point of fact, it takes a lot of time. And initially, it doesn't work. There were 2 mitzvot, and we didn't do well on either. So I'm jumping ahead here, but since the question was asked about the Shabbat, about the verse in this chapter that becomes the central verse, I would say, for Tractate Shabbat and Erevin, namely, Shavuish Tachtav Al Yetze Ishmim Kamo Bayom HaShvi'i. So from this, I jumped off to the Nisayon. What the idea of the Nisayon is, given the question about Nisayon. So this is very, very central to our chapter over here. Maybe I just review what we've done so far in terms of the issues that have been raised in the context of the Mon. There were several issues that we raised in the context of the Mon. One is, what is the idea of the Mon in general? That's the core issue. What is the purpose of the Mon, of giving food in this particular way? And we talked about the desert, freedom, insecurity of freedom, and learning to live with these insecurities and to have the faith that God will in fact provide. That's number one. And as I just mentioned, the idea of the Nisayon, what the purpose of the Nisayon is, Luman Anasenu, there's Rashi and the Ramban, but I talked about what is the Nisayon in general about, and I put it in educational terms. It's to teach you something, and it takes a long time to learn the lessons. Then the idea of the consequences of one's behavior. A free person has to understand that with freedom comes responsibility. And that's Laban Anasenu. And that's the idea of Mamtir Lochem Lechem Min Hashamayim, the idea of the Matar, which is always the instrument in the Torah of God's judgment, of bringing about the consequences of the behavior. It's the second paragraph of the Shema, and the word Matar appears in several contexts in the Torah. I'm not getting into all of them now, but it's always the same thing. If you misbehave, there won't be Matar. If you behave, there will be Matar. And Matar doesn't just mean rain, it can mean fire. It can mean sulfur, it can mean fire. It can mean many things. It can mean hail. It's not about rain. It's the way God relates to the world. That was an additional point that I wanted to emphasize over here. And then we will continue with this. And then, of course, the first point about work. The idea of the Mun being a story right smack in the middle of this book, which begins with labor, ends with labor, and the conjunction, and the difference between working for power and working for God. And I mentioned a couple of differences. Two in particular were highlighted. One is, when you work for Paro, he doesn't actually care about your work. It's not meaningful work because he has no interest in the work. Work's an excuse to break you down. When it comes to the Mishkan, it's all about purposeful labor, melechet machshevet. And secondly, this is a very interesting question that we'll have to deal with somewhere down the road. I mean, we're not studying Jewish philosophy, we're studying the Chumash, but these are issues that emerge from the text. And that is, what is the relationship between Shabbat on one hand and work on the other? Paro made it clear, there's no Shabbat. You can't have Shabbat. Lama Moshe v'Aaron tashibitu et ha'am. Paro said that. When it comes to the Mishkan, there we have the tremendous emphasis on the Mishkan and Shabbat, and two different places. Both of the instructions, which start in chapter 25 through 31, the end of 31. The last thing is V'shamru b'nei Yisrael et Shabbat, and then in chapter 35 to 40, the building of the Mishkan, it begins with 3 verses about Shabbat, about the prohibition of labor on Shabbat. So obviously, the Torah is suggesting there's some very profound relationship between the work that you do in building the Mishkan and the fact that you don't work on the Shabbat. That's something we should explore in the future, about what the Shabbat tells us about work in general. That's another point. I think we'll stop at this point, and we will continue next week. Let's see if we can finish up the story of the Mun next week. I will again call our attention to the parallel story in the book of Bamidbar in chapter 11, beginning in verse number 4. Once again, a complaint about the Mun. There they remember the fish and the watermelon and the cucumbers and all that. And once again, we'll have to see that. What is the complaint? What is God's response? Differences between the description of the Mun in our chapter and description of the Mun in Bamidbar chapter 11. If you have time during the week to take a look at that, it's actually very interesting. And that will be the subject of next week, which I look forward to. If anybody has any other comments or questions, first of all, you can always email me at dsilber@drisha.org, and I will respond to the best of my ability. I guess we'll stop at this point. This is a great chapter in the sense that it's really a central chapter of the book, and it raises, I think, really critical questions, not just in terms of the Chumash, but in general, in terms of life, in terms of the way we live life, how we see our life, how we see our work, etc. And all of those kinds of very, very central questions, which emerge very clearly from the story of the Mun. Okay, I'll stop at this point then, and we'll continue hopefully next week with the Mun.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I am glad you all returned for another session. I want to highlight one upcoming class. Next week on November 24th, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg will be teaching a class at 8 p.m. Eastern U.S. time on the topic of Rabbi Israel Salanter's revisioning of Orthodox Judaism. If you would like to join, you can sign up at Drisha, yitz.org/classes. I hope to see you all next week.
Yeah,
for
so let
more
me just say, add one thing in terms of Yitz. I think that, Yitz has been writing and speaking about his overall approach to Judaism for many, many years. And this latest book is really, he's worked on it for many years. I think it's called The Triumph of Life. And he really wanted to put out there some of his core thinking about living Jewishly in our time. It's his view. I think it's interesting to hear him, actually, to hear what he has to say. Whether we agree fully or not is not the point. But I think he's put out a lot of important questions there for us to think about. So I highly recommend that if you have a chance to listen to what Yitz has to say, I think it'll be worthwhile. In particular, the Muslim movement was very central to him. He grew up in a Muslim yeshiva, and I think he has some very interesting things to say about the Muslim movement in general. So I don't know what he's going to talk about specifically, but he's worth listening to. So I recommend you and your friends, if you have the time, to tune in and to participate. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you for
Thank
joining.
you.
I hope to see you
Thank
all
you.